From the world of politics.
Russia is losing this hopeless, hapless, ridiculous war in Ukraine, and here come the new members to NATO.
To the world of business.
I think the U.S. is not proven to be very reliable in terms of meeting the deals of treaties that it pulls other countries into. So I think that is going to be a major barrier.
This is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our television and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. President Biden is continuing his Asian trip. He's in Tokyo now, Japan. He's making news there already, particularly when it comes to Taiwan. To bring us up to speed, welcome now our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew. He is host of Sound On, weekdays on Bloomberg Radio. Joe, great to have you there at the White House. So the president's getting a lot of attention.
Yeah, it doesn't take a lot in this particular case here, David. The U.S. position on Taiwan has long been described by two words: strategic ambiguity. So any whiff of specificity is going to make news, as this president has learned before. In this particular case, he was at a news conference, as you mentioned, in Tokyo, and was asked about the U.S.'s intentions here and whether America would help to militarily defend Taiwan in a way that it has not with Ukraine. Here's what he said.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made.
Earlier, though, in that same briefing, David, the president said the U.S. has not changed its position at all with regard to Taiwan. White House officials seeking to clarify remarks were quick to emphasize the latter here, remembering that if this sounds familiar, David, that's because it's happened a number of times. At least 4 times Bloomberg has counted. This president and his aides have had to clarify or walk back comments about Taiwan, making some wonder if this might be somewhat intentional to get things, get people talking here, to get things moving here. I will also remind you that just last week, China's top diplomat said the U.S. was going down the wrong road with regard to Taiwan. David?
Yeah, whatever his intention, maybe he just believes it. Maybe he just really feels that.
That's right.
And it just comes out every time he gets asked the question. In the meantime, that's not the only issue involving China. We also had the president talk about at least talking with Secretary Yellen about removing those China tariffs.
Yeah, that's right. Trump-era tariffs. And, David, you've asked a lot of White House officials about this. It's something that's been in the air for quite some time, as this is going back before, obviously, Joe Biden was the president here. Indeed, he said he would speak to the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen when he returns to the U.S. He'll be back here, or at least heading back here, tomorrow evening. It's a delicate balance here. This is interesting. It really underscores the complexity of our relationship with China, David, because number one, we have to remember these were put in place as a response to China stealing intellectual property from U.S. companies. But there is also a thought that this could help to lower inflation here at home. So the president has an interesting and delicate decision to make in the days ahead.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much to Joe Matthew, who is, of course, host of Sound On every day of the week at 5 p.m. on Bloomberg Radio. In the meantime, Republican Senator from Pennsylvania, Pat Toomey, addressed this question of lifting China tariffs when he spoke with Bloomberg earlier today in Davos. And he said there's a division on the Republican side about whether they think it's a good idea or not.
This has become a divisive issue among Republicans when there used to be a very broad Republican consensus that was pro-trade, expanding trade, free trade agreements. That's diminished in all candor.
And we turn now to Randy Kroszner. He's economics professor at the University of Chicago Booth School, also former Fed governor. So thank you so much, Randy, for being with us. Let's talk about the possibility of lifting these tariffs, because one of the questions is, what difference would it make? Early on today, if you looked at the markets, they moved up. The equity markets moved up. Reportedly on this news, they were at least thinking about that possibility. Right now, they're well up, although on other news as well, like the S&P's up 1.9% as I look at the Bloomberg right now. Would it make that much of a difference if they did lift the tariffs?
So I think it's a step in the direction of trying to have better relations with China. And so I think that's probably why the markets liked it. In terms of inflation, it's not going to have much of an impact. This is a big tariff on a lot of what's imported from China. But overall imports from China are not that big compared with the overall U.S. economy. So although it would have a small impact, that probably would take time for it to actually be implemented. It's not going to make a big dent in inflation.
So just to pick a date at random, like by the time of November when there's a midterm election, would it make a big difference by then?
Why'd you pick that? Yeah, I think the impact would be relatively minor. I think other issues related to lockdowns in China, related to broader supply chain issues, the war, sanctions, those are much more first order issues. And of course, Fed interest rate policy is first order issue too.
Well, let's talk about Fed interest policy specifically. I mean, one question I think a lot of people are asking is, are we going to have to choose between recession on the one hand and letting inflation get out of control on the other? And let me be very specific, Randy. If the Fed really means they need to get that down to 2% within the near future, doesn't that mean almost necessarily they're going to have a recession?
What's so funny is people are rending garments now over the Fed getting to 2% interest. But I'm old enough to have lived through the late 1970s. Last time inflation was this high and interest rates were in double-digit levels. So if the Fed only needs to go to 2.5%, I actually don't think that means that recession is inevitable. I think there are a lot of headwinds. The economy is getting kind of a 1-2 punch. You've got all the sanctions, the war, and the uncertainties and the challenges that brings. You've got broader supply disruptions, and you've got the Fed raising interest rates. That's a tough time for the economy to be going robustly growing. But and a recession is not inevitable, but I do think the probability is significantly higher when you've got this 1-2 punch.
So, Randy, I'm going to exhibit a degree of impatience that you'll find amusing as an economist. You'll think, well, why don't you just be a little more patient? When are we going to see the inflation come down? I mean, some people think it's maybe peaking right now. We've got core PCE coming out this week. Do you think we'll see any reflection of a diminishment of inflation this week?
We might see a little bit, but I think inflation is still going to remain quite elevated for quite some time. Hopefully, some of the supply constraints will be coming down in the second half of the year. Hopefully, some of the tightening of financial conditions will lead people to be a little bit more cautious about spending. But I think there's a strong inflationary momentum that's there now, and this is why the Fed needs to act boldly and quickly to make sure inflation expectations don't get out of control, and then it becomes baked in, and then the Fed has to go back to those very high levels, hopefully not quite as high as in the late 1970s, early 1980s, but much higher than anyone would like.
So that's helpful to talk about the timing, not just the levels here.
Yes.
What is the trade-off there? If they move more early, what does that buy them?
So in my view, if they move more rapidly earlier, they won't have to move quite as high because they will have ensured that inflation expectations don't get out of control. They haven't become unanchored yet. They've moved up, but they're not out of the ranges where the intermediate to longer run inflation expectations haven't moved out of the ranges where they've been in over the last decade. Short expectations, sure, much higher. So if they can make sure that those expectations don't, those longer term expectations don't get out of control, I think they need to move quickly now, and they don't need to move as much later on. And so that's better for recovery. And if there is a recession, we'll make it less deep, so we don't have something like what happened in the early 1980s.
I understand the Fed is data dependent. They tell us that again and again and again. I take them at their word. But do they have, do you think, a number in the back of their head about what the destination is on rates?
I think there's a lot of different points of view on that. So as you can see, when they put out those infamous dot plots, just over the last few months, they've gone from having virtually no rate increases this year to getting to 2.5% this year, and possibly significantly more, 3% or so in the following year. I don't think that I think they would prefer not to go beyond 3 to 4. But and I'm hopeful that they don't have to, but they might need to if inflation keeps up and inflation expectations start to move up.
One more here, Randy. I have read that economists tell us that there is a sort of a natural relationship between the peak of inflation on the one hand and unemployment on the other. That is to say that after inflation peaks, historically what's happened is there's something like a 12 to 18-month lag, and then unemployment really peaks. Is that true, and what kind of unemployment should we be expecting?
This is the classic long and variable lags of monetary policy that Milton Friedman, a great University of Chicago economist, spoke about. There is a lot of uncertainty about how quickly monetary policy has an impact on the economy. It has an impact with a lag. The exact lags are hard to tell, and especially where we are now, given all the supply shocks, given that we're starting from nearly record low unemployment. Hard to say exactly what it would be, but it's not immediate, and it is going to play out over time.
Okay, Randy, thank you very much. And thanks for the plug for University of Chicago. That was very deftly done. Thank you. That's Randy Kroszner, who, by the way, teaches at the University of Chicago. Coming up, President Biden once again stirs controversy about U.S. defense of Taiwan. We talk with the president of the Council on Foreign Relations about whether we're seeing a change in U.S. policy. That is Dr. Richard Haas. Coming up here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We want to keep you up to date with news from all around the world. For that, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, President Biden says the United States military would intervene to defend Taiwan in any attack from China. That was some of his strongest language yet, seeking to deter Beijing from an invasion.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are.
That's the commitment we made.
The comments appeared to break with the longstanding U.S. policy of so-called strategic ambiguity. The White House later said the president simply meant the U.S. would provide military equipment to Taiwan, not send troops. A diplomat at Russia's United Nations mission in Geneva has resigned in protest of President Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Boris Bondarev is the first envoy to publicly criticize the war, telling Bloomberg, quote, Putin has become both a war criminal and a dictator. Bondarev posted a resignation statement in English and Russian on Facebook. In New York, police are searching for this unidentified man who they say shot and killed a Goldman Sachs employee on a subway train. The victim, 48-year-old Daniel Enriquez, worked for Goldman since 2013. Goldman calls the death a senseless tragedy. An increase in assaults on New York's subway system has prompted Mayor Eric Adams to boost the number of officers on patrol. Pfizer and BioNTech SE say their COVID vaccine is highly effective and prompted a strong immune response in children under the age of 5. The vaccine partners hope early trial results will pave the way for infants and toddlers to finally get immunized. They are expected to submit the necessary data to U.S. regulators this week to secure emergency use authorization for young children. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, President Biden really got some attention today when he made the reference to possible military support of Taiwan in case of an invasion. We turn now to a true expert in foreign policy. He is Dr. Richard Haas, president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the best-selling book, The World, A Brief Introduction. So, Richard, it strikes me that this is not the first time we've heard this sort of statement out of President Biden. At some point, he's not misstating. It's actually what he believes.
I don't know if the third time's the charm, David, but it's at least the third time. I'm not sure exactly why the White House keeps walking it back. As the president himself pointed out, it's totally consistent with our bilateral understandings with China. This is a unilateral American policy that's done for purposes of implementation of our policy. It's our business and that of our partners in the region. Also, the approach to Ukraine just doesn't make sense for Taiwan. Unlike our European allies who did not want to have direct military involvement in Ukraine, our Asian partners want it and expect it. Also, there's no Poland here. There's no country that you can feed arms into Taiwan. Taiwan's an island. So for all sorts of reasons, I think there's a strong strategic case for doing this. And if we were not to do this, if China were to do something, then that would be the end of the American-sponsored alliance system that has kept the most prosperous and most populous part of the world stable for 3/4 of a century now.
So when you say for doing this, I guess it's important what the this is, because my understanding is the commitment is to make sure that we provide them with the capability of defending themselves, arms, sort of the way we have the Ukrainians, not sending troops in. And some people read this as more actually having military intervention.
Well, that's how I read it. The idea that we would simply provide arms, that's the understanding under current policy. The president seemed to go farther than that. I hope so. Again, that's what our allies expect. We shouldn't kid ourselves. If we're not willing to directly get involved militarily on behalf of Taiwan, I think our ability to deter the mainland dramatically goes down, and our ability to defend Taiwan against the mainland significantly goes down. So I would actually argue, if you want to keep peace in this part of the world, if you do not want to see China ultimately dominate this part of the world, I actually think the willingness to get involved directly militarily on Taiwan's behalf will ultimately prove essential.
Well, and my question, Richard, because you are a diplomat, you've actually done this, both at the White House and the National Security Council, but also at the State Department at senior levels. What is likely to be the reaction of China? If we are a bit more aggressive in our statements, does that deter them, or does that potentially trigger them? Is it a sort of a dare you to come in?
I don't believe China's ready to come in militarily. Among other things, they significantly want to build up their nuclear arsenal. Conventionally, military, they're not ready for it yet. So I don't believe anything is imminent. Plus, as you know, China's got its hands full, among other things, with COVID. Xi Jinping wants to get the blessing from his party Congress this fall. But at some point down the road, I think this is a real possibility. But in the meantime, of course, they're going to complain. But again, I think it's important to point out we in no way changed the formal bilateral understandings that we have with China. The United States is not talking about recognizing an independent Taiwan or treating it as a sovereign entity. The goal here is simply to make sure that China does not try to coerce or use military force against Taiwan.
Richard, let's turn to Ukraine now. You mentioned that at the beginning. Some of the numbers that we're getting, if they're accurate, are pretty staggering about the losses on both sides. I saw a report today of maybe 25,000 Russian troops maybe have been lost dead and another 65,000 injured. In the meantime, we had President Zelensky say they're losing 100 a day. How long can these two sides sustain this level of loss?
I think there's two ways to think about the word sustain, David. Militarily, they could go on for some time, as high as these numbers are. The question is politically. I think Ukraine has unlimited political ability to sustain it almost, given that they're defending their own territory. It's a more interesting or complicated question for Russia because this is a war of choice. This is a war that Vladimir Putin chose to initiate. The problem is he is now some ways trapped himself. He doesn't want to give up without having a lot to show for it. So my own view is what we're probably likely to see is something of a military stalemate. And what I think Vladimir Putin would like to do is maintain a stalemate if he can advance, but do so at a lower rate of casualties. Whether he can accomplish that, it remains to be seen, though.
Well, suppose right now you called a truce. You stopped the parties exactly where they are. They had whatever land they had or didn't have, and that's where it ended up. Is that enough for Vladimir Putin to go back to his people and say it was worth it?
He could try to spin the information that he had expanded Russia's holdings in the Donbass and in the south. But for exactly that reason, I don't think it would be acceptable to Ukraine. They would worry that what begins as temporary would become permanent. A truce, a ceasefire, these would become new lines. And I simply don't think that the Zelensky government would be prepared to accept it, given, among other things, the atrocities that we've seen. So again, I'm really skeptical, David, of any diplomatic outcome being mutually acceptable at this point. Whatever it would take to be enough for the Russians, I believe would be too much for Ukraine.
And in the meantime, Richard, what about the mission for the United States and NATO? But take the United States first. We know that better. Do we have a clearly defined mission, or has it crept a bit since it first started? At the beginning, it seemed like we want to save Ukraine, as it were, save it as an independent entity, a free Ukraine. Now it feels like maybe we're going further than that with respect to try to undermine Russia.
David, it's the big question and it's the right question. Unfortunately, there's no obvious answer. Administration officials almost always say, well, we're going to defer to Ukraine. Well, the most recent Ukrainian statement from a senior military official is they want to go back to their original borders when they became an independent country in 1991. And while I understand that and indeed agree with that in principle, does that mean the United States is signing on to Ukraine using military tools provided by the United States now to accomplish that, to try to oust Russia from all of the Donbass, from all of the South, from all of Crimea? That, shall we say, is a tall order militarily and a rather, shall we say, potentially risky proposition. So I sit here and I watch this pretty closely. I'm confused, to be perfectly honest, about exactly what U.S. war aims are at this point.
Well, Richard, if you're confused, that's not good for us, I must say. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Richard Haas. He is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Coming up, markets looking for some good news. We're going to talk with Kriti Gupta to see if we can find some. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We have a nice rally going in equities right now, although I must say, given what's gone on so far this year, I'm a little reluctant to call it a rally. Let's turn now to Kriti Gupta to tell us what is going on. So a lot of green right now.
A lot of green. Green on the screen. The S&P 500 up to the tune of about 2%, David, and the NASDAQ actually underperforming 1.6%, but still not a number to scoff at for sure. I think there are three things we have to keep in mind here when we're looking at the stock market. The first is going to be simply the fact that we did hit that 20% bear market intraday yesterday. So some of this is purely a technical bounce, kind of that sentiment-driven rebound that you're seeing. The second driver is actually some comments made that by President Biden overnight during his trip to Asia. He did actually say that he is considering the tariffs on China to be removed. This is kind of a legacy from the Trump administration. And remember, this is something that he has kind of said before, not with as much, I would say, conviction as he did this time around, but he did make the argument that this might be one of the contributors to inflation. You really saw that in some of those import costs, the PPI data, the PMI data as well, all showing that. The third, and I think this isn't perhaps getting enough attention, is the weaker dollar. You are continuing to see a dollar slide down 0.6% at the same time that yields are higher. And I think that divergence is very key because it means foreign investors can now hop into the stock market a little more easily than they were able to before.
Okay, so how does it compare to history? We always make these comparisons. It's a little worse since last Wednesday, a little worse since 2008, whatever. Where are we?
Yeah, I think there's some like 27, 28 bear markets going back to the Great Depression. And if you actually look at this relative to history, this is my chart of the day, folks, actually, by the way, for our radio audience. Basically, you see on a drawdown basis, which essentially measures the peak to trough level, we're only down about 20%. Now, I say only with a massive grain of salt because that is certainly not something to kid about. But if you compare this to previous recessions, those numbers get to 40%. If you compare this to other times like 1962, 1987, where you're not in a recession, that's kind of what this looks like. So for the bulls out there, it contributes to the idea that maybe the bottom is in.
Yeah, you might not like it, but it's not as bad as it feels sometimes. Thanks so much to Kriti Gupta for that report on the markets. Coming up, President Biden's bold new vision for an Asian trade pact. We're going to talk with Wendy Culler of the Asia Society about whether it will work. And this is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. To keep you up to date with news from around the world, we turn to Mark Crumpton here with the first word.
David, thank you. President Biden said a U.S. recession wasn't inevitable, insisting that the challenges the domestic economy faces are less severe than much of the rest of the world, including China.
Your view, is a recession in the United States inevitable?
No.
Why not?
Our GDP is going to grow faster than China's for the first time in 40 years. Now, does that mean we don't have problems? We do. We have problems that the rest of the world has, but less consequential than the rest of the world has them because of our internal growth and strength.
The president made the remarks on the second leg of a 5-day trip to South Korea and Japan, his first to Asia as president. A Ukrainian court has sentenced a Russian soldier to life imprisonment for killing an unarmed civilian. That ends the first war crimes trial in the country after Vladimir Putin's invasion. The Kremlin has rejected allegations that its troops have committed war crimes. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia's economy should be shut off from the world, and he invited global investors to shift their resources into Ukraine to help rebuild the country. In a video address to the World Economic Forum in Davos, President Zelensky said this is the moment when it is decided whether brute force will rule the world. The District of Columbia sued Meta Chief Executive Officer Mark Zuckerberg for his alleged role in the data breach that allowed political consulting firm Cambridge Analytica to target Facebook users during the 2016 presidential election. D.C. Attorney General Karl Racine says an investigation revealed Zuckerberg contributed to lax oversight of user data that resulted in Cambridge Analytica and other third parties getting the personal information of 87 million Americans. Meta didn't immediately respond to a message seeking comment. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Well, we've been talking throughout the broadcast about President Biden's trip over to Asia, now in Tokyo, and his announcement, actually, of the IPEF, it's called. It's the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, something we have not gone through in detail, but we get to now with Wendy Culler. She's vice president of the Asia Society. Wendy, thank you so much for being back with us. Explain exactly what this IPEF would do.
So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is the Biden administration's economic blueprint for stepped up economic engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. It's not a traditional trade agreement. It will include some trade elements, but it's much broader than that, including pressing issues like supply chains, advanced technologies, and clean energy and anti-corruption.
Well, to give us a sense of how big it is, there's an estimate in the Bloomberg piece here. If it came to fruition, it could cover as much as 40% of the world's economy.
And that was a surprise of the announcement today that 12 other countries in the region joined the United States in announcing this new initiative. Just a few months ago, it looked like maybe only 5 countries would be at the table. So this is impressive, although there's hard work ahead because the details have not been fleshed out yet. And when you sit down with 12 other countries and try to work on details, and particularly when the United States will be seeking a high ambition agreement, we'll see how things, play out.
Yeah, details have a way of getting in the way of getting to agreement, don't they? Give us a sense of timetable here. If this went forward, are we talking about years?
My understanding is the administration is talking about 12 to 18 months. But importantly, they've said that if certain aspects of this deal are ready before other aspects, they're ready to announce that. And I think particularly with respect to supply chains, that would be critical. If progress can be made on supply chains in terms of perhaps finding ways to reduce vulnerabilities and shocks and disruptions to supply chains, why not move earlier? And we can all benefit from those outcomes.
Wendy, as you know so well, international trade agreements have tricky politics back here at home, particularly up on Capitol Hill. Typically in a deal, you have to give up something to get something. What is the United States willing to give up that is attractive to these other countries in the Indo-Pacific region? And would that run afoul of Congress?
Well, that's exactly what I've been hearing from other Asian countries. And that is, since the United States has made clear that we do not want to lower our tariffs, what's in this deal for the other countries. And that will also need to be worked out in the coming months. Now, many of these countries, they do want the United States back with a robust economic agenda in the region. So IPEF will go a long way in scratching that itch. But again, when they work out the details and the countries, when the countries learn what's in it and what funds are being provided, what capacity building's being provided, and what they're going to be asked to do, that's when the rubber will hit the road on this initiative, in my view.
China's already come out and had some things that are not very enthusiastic to say. I think it's fair about this. By the way, as I understand, neither China nor Taiwan is included in this. As a practical matter, does China's position make it more likely or less likely that the other Asian countries would go along with this?
Well, China's trying to drive wedges between the United States and other Indo-Pacific countries. And so I'm sure Beijing was not happy today to see the other 12 countries joining President Biden to announce this initiative. That said, the word China does not appear in this initiative anywhere. And the United States has been clear that this is an affirmative, a positive agenda where the United States will kind of lay out its vision of the standards and norms for the Indo-Pacific region going forward.
Have the Pacific countries, Asian Pacific countries, sort of forgotten about the Trans-Pacific Partnership? So they say, look, that was in the past, we're willing to go forward? Or is there part of this saying, you know what, you took us down this road once before and then essentially pulled the rug out from under us?
Well, they certainly haven't forgotten about it. And my understanding is that Prime Minister Kishida even raised the CPTPP with President Biden during their bilateral talks. But there is, they are concerned that if through the IPEF, they're asked to make a lot of concessions, what happens 2 years from now if there's a new administration? Will this initiative, be torn up and the next administration will move on to something different? And that's going to be another hurdle for the administration that they'll need to cross and assure our trading partners that this is a durable initiative that would survive through another administration.
This economic framework is not the only thing that President Biden's working on while he's over there. There have been a variety of things, both in Seoul, South Korea, as well as in Tokyo, Japan. And then we have the Quad meeting, and it's coming up tomorrow. Give us a sense overall from the trip, what's being accomplished?
Well, this is the president's first trip to the region as president. He had a very successful meeting in Seoul, South Korea, meeting with the new Korean president, touching on having new investments by Samsung and Hyundai in the United States, employing thousands of U.S. workers, and also working on important security matters. And now he's meeting with Japan. He's met with Japan today. And tomorrow, Prime Minister Modi from India and the new Australian Prime Minister will join Kishida and Biden for what's called the Quad meeting, the four leaders of the key democracies in the Indo-Pacific to continue their work on pressing issues in the region. A very important grouping and another one that's of grave concern to China.
Well, to that point specifically, Wendy, one of the things that President Biden promised as a candidate for president was he was going to bring a multilateral approach to many issues around the world, but specifically when it comes to Asia and China. Is he delivering on that, in your opinion, at this point?
Oh, absolutely. And I think this trip underscores that. The fact that 12 other countries joined him for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Initiative, and the fact that tomorrow the Quad leaders are going to have their third meeting now since he took office. So in terms of working with other partners in the region, I think he gets an A here. Where more work will need to be done, again, in both of these initiatives, is substance and how much further they can go with respect to producing meaningful outcomes that really further the U.S. vision for the region.
Okay, Wendy, thank you so much for being back with us. That's Wendy Cutler. She's Asia Society Vice President. Coming up, we get our weekly update on the primary season leading up to those midterms with political contributors Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Every week we take a look at the midterms. We call it Midterm 2024 to figure out where we are. And to help us do that, we turn to our political contributors, Jeannie Shan Zano of Iona College and Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital. So before we go forward to tomorrow, let's go back to last Tuesday because we're not quite done yet, as best I understand it. Rick, what's going on with that race on the Republican side for the Senate?
Well, there's a razor lead that Mehmet Oz has over David McCormick by just over 1,000 votes. And I don't think we're ever going to see that really change that much. There are very few votes left to be counted, less than 8,000 Republicans. And so I think we're turning our attention to June 7th deadline for the recount. And Pennsylvania is very good at what they do when it comes to elections, contrary to what some former presidents might say. And I think the recount will go fine without a hitch. Teams are all built, and we'll know who the winner is on June 7th.
So, Jeannie, will we know what the winner is? I mean, I'm old enough to remember 2000. I still have the scars to prove, covering for ABC News. When we did the recount in Florida, you could have done that recount every single time and come up with a different result. I guarantee you.
That's right. And I'm not sure anybody's going to be satisfied with whatever result comes out. And of course, you've got Dr. Oz now skating right up to what I call the Trump line, where Trump is saying, just say you won. Don't keep counting any of those votes and just go ahead and say you won. And over the weekend, as the McCormick team said, like a judge said, that undated absentee ballots could now be counted. You had Dr. Oz accusing McCormick of taking a piece from the Democratic playbook, if you will. And so he's skating right up to this Trump line, and it's going to be curious to see how this ends. I think there's going to be, certainly a recount, but also lawsuits to follow.
Okay, so Pennsylvania is so last week. Let's go forward to tomorrow. Georgia particularly. We got 3 different states, but Georgia is the one we're focused on. And Rick, really that governor's race. There's a Senate, but I think we know who the 2 candidates are likely to be. In the Senate, it's really sort of almost a grudge match for President Trump, right?
Oh, yeah. The Senate is a grudge match later on, but the governor's race is really what matters. He has taken a strong opposition to existing Governor Kemp with his friend and former senator. But it looks like this may be a foregone conclusion. Really, now the pundits are looking at this saying, can Kemp get over 50% and avoid a runoff? Most polls have him somewhere between 50 and 55%. So that's going to be what most people watch. I think that's a foregone conclusion as to who's going to win. Question is, do we have to sit through another runoff?
Well, but Jeannie, could the former President Trump actually win this at the same time he's losing, in the sense that he doesn't get who he wants for governor, but he might get who he wants for Secretary of State?
That's right. He famously has used his vendetta campaign against current Governor Kemp, but also the Secretary of State Raffensperger. And in the Secretary of State race, Donald Trump's endorsed candidate may very well win that race. I would suggest that regardless of who wins the governor's race, Donald Trump will claim that he did, claim some kind of victory there, and certainly in the Secretary of State's race. And what's so important about that, both in Georgia and Pennsylvania, is, of course, the Secretary of State has a huge role in the 2024 presidential race. And that's why Donald Trump has focused so intently on getting sort of his lieutenants in line in Secretary of State positions across the country. In case he wins, they'll have a huge role in determining what the ballots are and how they move forward to Washington, D.C. to count that race.
Jeannie, I'm going to let you go to Texas because I know it's one of your favorite ones. It's the Attorney General primary. And is P2 Bush to win in Texas?
It's neck and neck there. I think he may very well lose that race. It's certainly neck and neck, probably too close to call at this point. But it's fascinating because you've got George P. Bush, against the sitting incumbent who is running, but also who has been indicted, who has, suffered enormously under legal challenges, and yet is the leading state and law enforcement official in the state, and yet still may come out ahead there. But it certainly is, maybe we are seeing the last gasp for a Bush in Texas, at least in the near term, if P. Bush loses this race.
So, Rick, what does that say? Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the underbelly of this one is really amazing because George P., whose father, grandfather, and uncle all got excoriated by Donald Trump as president, really tried hard to get this endorsement by Donald Trump to win this race. And what was really interesting about it is, why did you think that Trump would ever endorse anybody other than his loyalist, Ken Paxton, who was there on January 6th, was a denier of the election. And so this has been kind of an embarrassment for the Bush clan. And not only that, but it's now if he loses this race, he's going to be seen as sort of the last Bush to have actually been able to take advantage of the name and misused it.
Yeah, at the same time, Jeannie, what does this say? I guess I shouldn't be surprised this way about the Republican Party, where you're better off actually being accused of crimes than being named Bush.
Yeah, it's the state of the Republican Party at this point. And, it really shows you that Donald Trump, he's won some and lost some so far in this election cycle, but his endorsement still really does matter, because here you do have somebody who's under federal indictment. Here you have somebody who the state bar in his own state is challenging him. He's been accused of crimes. The FBI is investigating him. And yet he is likely to win this, in part because he has gone what President Biden calls ultra MAGA in that state, and he does have this endorsement. Even John Cornyn came out on Thursday and said, this is quite an embarrassment that our top law enforcement official is under indictment, and that's not likely to change the outcome of this election.
Pretty extraordinary. Thank you so much. Fortunately, Rick and Jeannie are going to be staying with us. We're going to take a look at two stories that may be coming in a collision. On the one hand, the dramatic redistricting here in the state of New York, and now we have former Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York City running. At the same time, we had a terrible, tragic shooting over the weekend. What happens when a Democrat has to deal with law and order? We're going to talk to Jeannie and Rick about that next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We're going to continue now our report on midterms 2022. I think I said 2024. I'm getting ahead of myself. 2022. And for that, we turn to Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shanzano of Iona College. So, Jeannie, we have two or three different stories sort of colliding in New York. We still have this ongoing redistricting thing. I think it's getting settled now. We're down to the wire. That has caused our former mayor in New York City, Bill de Blasio, to put his hat in the ring out in Brooklyn in Park Slope. In the meantime, we had this terrible, tragic shooting at, I think it was 10:30 in the morning, 11:30 in the morning on Sunday here in New York, re-emphasizing the issue about law and order. How does Bill de Blasio run on a law and order campaign?
I remember when Bill de Blasio ran in 2014, and of course then crime was extremely low in comparison to what it had been as you looked like 10 years prior. And so he ran, and you still had voters at that time very concerned. If we all recall sort of that Bill de Blasio was going to be so lenient with criminals that there would be a return to the 1970s levels of crime. And of course, he served his terms and has come out with fairly low approval ratings as it comes to crime. So it's something he's going to have to address. And of course, now we are in the later stages of the pandemic, and violent crime in New York City is way up. I mean, you mentioned the horrific shooting over the weekend on Sunday. We also a month ago had 10 people wounded in a shooting on the subway. This is a real problem, and polls say that New Yorkers, 50%, say their number one issue, even above inflation, is crime. So he's going to have to address it. His record is going to make it really, really hard to appear tough on crime.
Rick, what about it? How does a Democrat run in this race on the question of crime? Because I suspect this is a problem not just in New York City. You see it in Chicago, you see it in San Francisco, you see it in various, particularly cities across the country.
Well, all you got to do is open a paper and read the headlines every day. There's no more horrific crime being occurred. Violent crime is on the way up and has been very high in the last 2 years. So you're not going to escape the issue. And the question is, what is going to be the resolution of this? What are the platforms that the Democratic Party are going to have? What is Bill de Blasio going to say? And there's been very little, because there's been so much pressure coming from the left, the progressive left in the Democratic caucus, over trying to be, more punitive toward the cops than they are to the criminals. And so I think one of the things that the Democratic Party has to do is come to grips with this issue and start finding ways that they can actually communicate to voters that make them look tough on crime. And right now, they don't have a platform.
And David, I was just going to add, one of the things where Bill de Blasio could very well pull this out. I mean, he's got a lot of competition. There's a lot of people already in this race, some of them very popular progressives themselves. But of course, whoever wins the Democratic primary here is going to carry it away in the general election. New York City is, of course, famously really now a one-party city, except for certain segments potentially of Staten Island and places where Nicole Malliotakis district, for instance. So if he's able to pull this through with supportive progressives who get out to vote for him over the other progressives, he will likely be elected to Congress.
Rick, do you see any Democrats out there that have a good way of doing this? I mean, I'll throw out a name, for example, Eric Adams, a police veteran, was a captain in the New York City Police Force, now the mayor of New York City.
Yeah, he's taken a decidedly different approach than Bill de Blasio did when he was mayor, and he's supporting the increase in the police force, bigger budgets, more personnel, putting them back out on the street. Otherwise, I'd say that he's also a victim of the circumstances. He's had a couple of horrific crime waves in New York, a couple of shooter incidents that have gotten international attention. And those things are hard to avoid, but important to manage. And I think so far he's shown he can manage them. The question is, if they continue, does he lose public support in the process?
Every week it's a treat to talk with our political contributors, Rick Davis of Stone Court Capital and Jeannie Shan Zeno of Iona College. Rick and Jeannie, thanks so much. Check out the Balance of Power newsletter on the terminal and online. Coming up, we're going to talk about Operation Warp Speed, whether it should apply to baby formula. And this is Bloomberg.